Bringing life into the world is a beautiful thing. To that, people the world over can attest. I find myself pondering the idea of it often, wondering how it feels to bring a new creation into being, to see it grow and learn and thrive. I've wanted that. How incredible it must be. And I envy those who have experienced it. But during my work today I found another text that filled my head with questions. What if your creation hated you? What if it was more of a monster than a person? What if the life you brought into this world only yielded suffering to those around it? And strangely, I began to ask, what if it existed before you, and you were just the artisan of its physical body? What if you were merely the builder of the avenue upon which it walked from one plane to another, and not the origin of its existence? Would it really be your creation, your child, or would you just be a gateway? For all we know, that's how it is for all of us. What we are before or after this life, if anything at all, is a great unknown. And I suppose there's a chance that each and every one of us was not created here, but brought here. Therefore, in the story you are about to hear, the question must be asked. If life is indeed brought into the world, what does it owe its harbinger? If it is vile, must it show mercy? Should it be thankful? And of course, what if that life was the forerunner for something even greater? Something uglier, something truly evil. The Spires of Innqeshak. Far beyond the settlements of Arbelisle, hidden in the deep, unmapped mountains, lies a place so forlorn that no eye of the Dragonish has seen it. Not until now, that is. The looming peaks and fish-scale ridges give way to a valley tucked beneath sheer cliffs, harboring a forest so dense with trunks that it took weeks to traverse and map. Even sorcerers, with all their power, could not recede the thick foliage and roots, and as for those scouting a trail through the woods, a fear would overcome them as a presence was felt roaming the wilderness. It chilled their bodies, causing all to glance over their shoulders at random times, always expecting to see a shadow watching them from behind. But it was not this presence that drew Amiel Sindir to the valley of Innqeshak. Rather, it was the 100 spires protruding upward from the forest, at 3 times the height of its trees, for they were not natural structures, but handcrafted by a people unknown. His lineage was that of archaeologists, sorcerers, chemists, and diviners, and, like many Dragonish, he sought to understand the curse which had befallen Silverwind. He believed the answer lied in times long forgotten, in the ancient civilizations that inhabited the world before the arrival of the synthesis. This led him to search the farthest wilds, and for many years he hunted for the location of a lost valley that appeared in recently discovered texts all over the realm. According to the stories inscribed therein, a potent magic dwelled within the valley, locked inside its cage of wood and rock, and wandering in a loop of engineered madness. Its creators wanted it to remain there forever. However, not even the authors of the texts could describe the power emanating through the soil, permeating every plant and stalking behind every tree of the forest, like an unseen hunter, eternally trapped and awaiting the day it found vengeance on the ones who put it there. The magic felt conscious. It felt thirsty. It resented its chains, and the hatred it amassed over thousands of years in captivity was like a bloated corpse soon to burst. But the spires of Innqeshak restrained this magic like a seal, and though the magic's purpose was unknown, the expedition was designed to answer that very question. It took years of preparation, travel, and funding, and Amiel searched the lands of Arbalile for a decade of time, and upon one dark evening while venturing out from a campsite in the wilderness, he discovered the valley. As he stared from high above on its cliffs, an array of lights danced in the forest below, like spirits parading through ethereal villages. In the spires, blue flames lit up in slits on each level, like torches sent from the heavens to spread light inside a holy and sacred place. And in the coming weeks, he gathered resources to descend the cliff faces and delve into the valley, which led to the very moment he stood at the base of one such spire, mystified by its grandeur and timeless beauty as he gazed up its outer wall. Every stone was covered in ancient pictures, some even bearing the remnants of colorful dye, and they told a story remarkably similar to the ones unearthed at other archaeological sites. The rock and engraved metal was warm to the touch, and Amiel could sense a greater flow of magic within that earthen tower than the entire forest behind him. If he hadn't known better, he would have tried communicating with it. The entrance was sealed stubbornly shut, and this was echoed by other nearby spires. Seemingly nothing could get in, not even the strongest enchantments and most resilient tools brought for excavation. But Amiel had planned for this. If traditional methods couldn't open the spires, he would use another: explosives. The expedition had plenty for the immediate future, and more could be transported in time. It was early morning when the boom thundered inside the valley, and as the winged creatures fled their perches in the trees, as smoke dissipated from the ground, a crevice had formed in the spire's base, granting all those gathered outside the right to enter. And enter they did. Amiel led the way through a crack not large enough to fit 2 people, and when he stepped from the light and into the darkness, it felt like walking into a new reality. The air tasted impossibly clear, like it came from an age that preceded time, and was therefore untainted by the spoiling breath of the synthesis. He could feel energy on the draft. Like a rush of water, it coursed through the chambers of the spire, intricately weaving a trail of crumbs to follow. Its presence was an allegory of a past so removed it might as well have been fiction, yet now someone had arrived to decipher the meaning. Staring into the black, he knew they'd struck the richest vein of history imaginable, and with it, hope. "This is what we've been waiting for," Amiel said. "This will lead us to salvation. I can feel it." The excavation commenced, and for the next 3 weeks, Amiel's crew spent time withdrawing artifacts and taking samples. Meanwhile, he delved into the furthest reaches of the spire to gain a comprehensive understanding of its function. A resonant magic pervaded the interior more intensely with every level he climbed, producing a high-pitched sound he couldn't get out of his head. Even in his bed at night, he heard it, the penetrating yet mild cry of power unknown. It kept him awake far too often. It wasn't until he reached the uppermost chamber of the spire that Amiel felt the noise go quiet. In fact, all noise turned to silence in that consecrated place, even his own voice. He felt a presence there, a being, and within its holy temple none could speak, for it chose to keep them in a state of reverence. The chamber contained a brass statue in the center, one depicting not dragonkin nor creature, but an organ. It was much larger than Amiel himself, and bizarrely was the clear depiction of a pair of lungs connected by a single stem. Despite being made of metal, or perhaps what appeared to be metal, the lungs inhaled and exhaled, wheezing with each tired breath as their glossy flesh filled and emptied. A kind of acidic steam simmered up from the corroded, blue-green sacks like a freshly butchered carcass in the freezing cold. The odor was staunch in its ability to penetrate, for even when Amiel held his breath, it seeped into his stomach and created a rancid nausea like poison in his veins. This discovery was not what he was expecting, yet it was everything he could have dreamed. The unimaginable is far more curious than the familiar, and in this instance, Amiel hadn't the slightest clue what this meant or why the lungs existed. He only knew that they did. However, that lack of knowledge would be temporary. Of that he was certain. For the next week, he spent all hours of the day inside the upper chamber, studying the lungs, listening to them, and testing them. He managed to shave off a sliver of the tissue, and upon deconstructing it with alchemical equipment, he discovered it wasn't metal at all. It was indeed flesh, but when examined beneath a magnifying lens, he noted that it was woven together like thread, and was so hard that it had the durability of common silverware or weaponry. It seemed as though the lungs were created, like they were produced in a laboratory, and yet they breathed without fuel, without blood flow, without a heart or mind, and if magic flowed through them, Amiel could not detect it. Occasionally, when he had his back turned to the lungs and was immersed in research, he swore there came a weak, hissing voice that sounded like it could hardly breathe. He couldn't respond, of course, not in that chamber, and in the back of his mind he questioned if the voice was real or a figment of his sleep-deprived mind. Then again, the voice itself didn't matter. The lungs spoke to him in other ways, with their energy, their desire to be made whole, to walk, to emerge from the valley in which they were trapped. He simply knew. They wanted to escape their prison. But how could that be done? Amiel surmised that opening the other spires might provide him with an answer. As soon as he could, he gathered a team and the appropriate materials, then carved his way through the forest to the next tower, where he again ordered explosives to be placed before the entrance. Following a blast that echoed through the valley and a plume of smoke, the entrance gave way, and Amiel was once again the first to step foot inside. He entered into a dark, resonant chamber with magical energy so powerful it felt like being smothered beneath a dense blanket. The air was staler in that spire, unlike the first, in which the very act of breathing had the potential to make one feel new. There was a difference in the flow of energy as well, as it pulsed rather than flowed. In heavy waves, a stifling magic brushed against him in repeated sequence, and it felt so alive. While his crew began their work in the base, Amiel made his journey to the tower's highest floor, climbing a string of spiraling stairs that had no apparent end. The stonework was damp, covered in a substance that clung to the surface like a greasy film over exposed muscle, and along the black rock walls an intricate series of veins spread. When he reached the end, he understood why all of this was here. He understood what the spires were for. In the holy temple of the second spire, in its sanctum above the valley, Amiel found another organ. This time, it was a heart. The atriums clunked and released hot air, pumping the room with the smell of iron, while the arteries tightened and loosened. Veins connected to these, spreading like a canopy to the ceiling, the floor, and the walls, and, presumably, the whole tower. Again, he could not speak or make noise, and unlike before, his own heart beat faster in the presence of the giant one before him, like it recognized its master through the wall of his chest, and yearned to burst forth to coalesce with it. Because of this, Amiel realized how he must proceed. He must open up the spires, gather the organs and body parts that he had just confirmed were there, and put them together. It would require immense research, intricate magic usage, and heaps of time, perhaps even years. But in the end, it would all be worth it. After all, the lungs, and now the heart, spoke to him with a voice that no one else could hear, and they told him that the finished product outweighed all expense, even if it cost lives. The Spires were indeed a prison, and he was going to free the captive within. Therefore, as the following days faded into weeks, then melted into grueling months, Amiel's fervor increased, never faltering despite losing many nights of needed rest. He would add to a growing diagram of the body as its parts were discovered. He would map the spires and all their chambers, and study every piece of flesh his crew found. And while he didn't know what species he had unearthed, the creature was magnificent. Its muscles were like threads of gold, malleable but hard, and they tarnished just the same. A single limb was nearly twice his entire height and weight, and while it didn't have skin, it didn't have scales or feathers or fur either. Instead, the creature had a glossy sheen that hardened over its body like a protective glass case, allowing its entrails and musculoskeletal system to be viewed at all times. Its body was still incomplete, but it took a form similar yet foreign to the peoples of Silverwind, with crystal tusks protruding from its jaw, with no apparent eyes or mouth, with the figure of a human or an elf, and with naturally clawed hands like the dragonish. It was like an amalgamation of the world's inhabitants, and despite so much similarity, it carried multiple additions that were shared by no other. The tusks, in particular, were of note. With every piece of the being Amiel stitched together, the louder its voice became, and though it never spoke directly, its dreams seeped into his mind at night. One dream came most frequently, and it felt real enough that he assumed it wasn't just a nighttime wandering of his mind, but a projection to another time and place. He would find himself standing on a rocky outcropping at the edge of a roaring waterfall. Mists drifted up as it poured into the woodlands below, and the water was clearer than the purest gemstone, a far cry from lakes or rivers in the region today. Looking out, he saw a valley of lush green forest surrounded by cliffs, like a natural bowl carved out from the landscape, and he recognized it as Innqeshak, without all the spires. As he gazed out, an entity formed from the waterfall's mist and took shape before him. It was like a hovering mass of clear water, undulating and fluctuating in the air, meeting him at the cliff's edge like a god stepping down to embrace its creation. The water asked him what he intended to do when it had a body, a question to which he gave a clear answer. I desire to learn. And when questioned to what end, he responded with the truth, so that I may restore our world. It was always this exact conversation that occurred, and he'd wake up shortly after the experience. However, it changed one night when, inside the dream, he gave a different answer to the water. He told it, My aim is to see you for what you really are, and to worship. As a reply, the entity did not speak or cast him out of the dream. Instead, it engulfed him, trapping Amiel in a sphere of water, and just as he began to inhale and choke, he was spat out onto a stone floor in a place disconnected from the cliffside. Coughing and gasping for air, he composed himself, and realized this was the same chamber that contained the very first body parts of the creature that he discovered, the lungs. And while he rose respectfully to his feet, the entity gave him a simple, yet strange command. Bring me a voice. The months went by, and as Amiel's team continued entering the spires and retrieving the body parts within, he wrestled with the dream's meaning. What voice did the entity need? Could it be speaking in metaphors? Was it literal? As the body took shape and but a few pieces were still undiscovered, he couldn't find the answer. As for the 100th tower, they discovered it to be larger than the rest, and completely hollow inside, with a spiraling staircase that wound up its colossal throat. Along the walls, intact murals depicted a story, or more than likely, a history of the valley. If the murals were to be trusted, then at one time an ancient cave system was unearthed there, forming a string of chasms beneath the land, and when searched by the people of old, an immortal being was found slumbering within. They awakened it, and the chaos that followed shook the foundations of science and magic all at once. The being had no body, and instead existed in a state of illusions, only appearing in the minds of those who entered its domain. It could take any form from their imagination, even appearing as a dead loved one, a repressed memory, a childhood fantasy, or a fusion of unknown sights, sounds, and emotions stored within the soul. It would speak with them, communicating with many people at once, as if it were trying to learn about the world beyond the valley, and from this the people learned as well. For instance, they learned the creature's name. It referred to itself as Innqeshak, and it had slept beneath the soil, below the rivers, and underneath the forest for millennia, never waking until the moment it was unearthed. They also learned to interact with its unknown kind of magic, using a type of astral canvas to communicate indirectly, to witness the interior of the subconscious mind, and perhaps one day to not just see memories, but interact with them as if to alter the past. As time went on, Innqeshak desired a body. It wanted to walk among its new companions and to learn about the world through their eyes. From their perspective, this only seemed reasonable, given that their experience with the being had only been positive until then, as well as insightful. Untapped knowledge was being unleashed daily to them, and because of that, they sought to grant Innqeshak's wish. The effort was painstaking, and the magic required to fashion a body was immense, taking hundreds of mages and artificers more than 10 years to achieve its basic form, plus another 4 to refine it. When it was completed, a ritual was fashioned by the greatest sorcerers among them, and in a single night under the numinous reign of the moon, Innqeshak inhabited the body. Life was breathed into an empty shell. Spirit was transferred from the astral realm to the physical world, and with the first beat of its heart, Innqeshak was ushered into the life of a mortal for the first time. It could walk the valley under which it had slept for eons, and experience Silverwind through a medium it never before understood. It could harness its magic beyond just a whisper of ethereal power, and interact with all elements, energies, and existence, rather than view them through a distorting curtain of separation. The end of the historical account was indecipherable, due to damage in the spire's uppermost murals and stairs, but it was presumed something caused the people of old to regret their decision, and to disassemble Innqeshak's physical body. For one reason or another, they couldn't, or perhaps they wouldn't, remove it from the valley, and destroying it wasn't their goal either. Instead, they built the spires and locked the artificial body away, with a different piece in each one. Naturally, time obscured their motives even more so, and while the story of Innqeshak was astounding, Amiel found the most curious detail to be the one that wasn't mentioned, and that was the creature's missing voice. Innqeshak could communicate in dreams, in faint, faraway callings that were more akin to illusory phantoms of the mind than actual words. This was distant from the being's communication with the people of old, who heard its voice with such clarity that conversations could be had, and exchanges of knowledge could occur. Was Innqeshak in a weakened state? And if so, was that intentional? Whoever sealed the body inside the spires may have had a reason to quiet its voice as well, or, more precisely, its influence. Still, Amiel sought to complete the body, and upon climbing the last tower, he located the final piece, the larynx, and within it, the vocal cords. Trying to reach and remove the body part led to the deaths of 3 people in Amiel's crew, as an unknown magic stole the life from their bodies the moment it was touched. Whoever sealed it there didn't want it to be removed. His sorcerers were employed for the task, and after 3 days they broke the tightly woven spells that were sealing away the final addition to Innqeshak's body, and Amiel himself took responsibility for removing it from its shackles. At last, after so much time, he could piece the creature together. The process was tedious. A group of 14 mages, physicians, and scientists labored day and night, as did Amiel, and after 10 days, the body lay completed upon the large stone altar. The vocal cords were one of the last pieces to be added. Following this, a ritual was necessary that could move Innqeshak from one plane to the next, then into the body. There were no known methods of doing this, but many secrets found refuge within the spires, and Amiel began a hunt to draw this one in particular out of hiding. By torchlight, he prowled the spires once more, finding a network of passages running below them filled with artifacts, murals, and ancient writings, and as the weeks passed, just when the expedition began to slow and fall apart, he found a chamber in the deepest part of the cave system. Down there, a magic dwelled, observing from behind every shadow, and it was so potent and thick that being near it felt like being submerged in water. There were remnants of a shrine and altar, and he wondered if this was the site of Innqeshak's first invocation to the corporeal plane of existence. The people of old could have used that chamber for their own ritual, and if so, perhaps the details of its methods and mechanisms remained intact. His team examined the chamber for many days, finding bits of ash, pieces of gemstones, and the stale residue of an exceedingly powerful spell. All the while, Amiel could hear Innqeshak's voice while simultaneously not hearing it, like a conscience prodding him to take the correct action. As time passed, they deciphered the clues spread out before them and used their own knowledge of the arcane to fashion what they believed was the proper spell, then brought Innqeshak's body to the same altar upon which it laid thousands of years prior. And then, with all his team gathered in the chamber, the ritual began. The spell required a chemical mixture that would emit fumes that altered the air to a thicker, nearly liquid state, and a collection of fires, gemstones, and mirrors that could reflect the proper colors and focus all light to a single point, the brain of Innqeshak's lifeless body. A low, anxiety-inducing hum had to resonate throughout the entire process, and for this task Amiel employed 8 of his workers to maintain the constant vocal hymn. Then came the use of magic, the darkest and rarest kind of all. A large portion of blood from a sapient creature was required, and Amiel offered himself for the task. It would not be fatal, but debilitating for a short while, and he believed it was more than worth a few days of lethargy. The sorcerers accompanying him gathered around the altar as he held his wrist over Innqeshak's body, and with a single cut from a sapphire blade, the first drops of blood spilled onto the clear skin below. Every flame in the room began to dance. For Amiel, the bleeding would be extensive, as the spell called for much of it, and as minutes passed he began to feel lightheaded. Meanwhile, his sorcerers began their part of the ritual, and the clear blood changed direction, not falling, but rising to the air instead. A mesmeric chant arose from the sorcerers, as did a transfer of energy from their bodies, as magic was released in tangible waves, filling the chamber with a pulse similar to that of a heartbeat, as the blood pooled into a cloud above Innqeshak's body. As fatigue took over and Amiel could hardly stand, he set fire to the wound and sealed it, all while an orb of blood spun above the altar, thinning out as it grew in size. At that point, the air density thickened, breathing became difficult, the torches began to flare, and after the blood grew wider and wider, it began collapsing on itself, folding inward into the shape of a body, Innqeshak's body, and the fires grew ever brighter because of this. The air started to suffocate those who breathed it. And finally, as the transfer of Innqeshak between worlds began, the blood crashed into the lifeless form upon the altar, and like sudden blindness, all light went away, rendering every eye in the chamber without sight. Bizarrely, a splash never came, but the sound of absorption echoed. And then, silence. Weariness gripped Amiel like many sleepless nights had gone by, and he could hardly breathe, as if a choking arm was wrapped around his neck. But he clung to the idea that the ritual had worked. He listened in the darkness for the voice of Innqeshak, for the quietest trace of proof. Had he succeeded? Was it done? The air pressure changed as a draft began pulling toward the altar like a gust of wind, and with it came the ability to breathe again, yet so did the horrific sound of screams throughout the chamber. One by one, his team began crying out in a choir of agony like they were being torn apart. But there was no movement, only noise. Not a single thud, shuffle, and attempt to run away. Just rasping cries that rattled against the walls. And they continued until the last one fell silent, leaving Amiel to question whether or not he was there alone. Amiel called out, but his voice echoed and he got no response. After that, he tried creating a flame, but discovered he had too little energy to do so. And yet, it didn't matter, for the chamber's torches suddenly ignited once more, revealing a truth he had no explanation for. Everyone in the room was gone. They had vanished without leaving behind the slightest indication they were ever there. As for the altar, it was vacant also, and as Amiel turned to search the area, he saw the towering figure of Innqeshak standing more than 3 times his height. What a monstrous sight the creature was. Muscles, bones, and organs were exposed beneath its glassy skin, and though he had seen it before, the image of it standing upright caused every muscle in his body to tremble in reverence. He was standing before a god, and from that first look, he knew that being wasn't meant to exist in their world. "You have aided me," Innqeshak said clearly, "so I will grant you a choice." The being's voice was low and disorienting, almost like it could cause madness through a single word. "You may leave the valley and survive. The ones I have taken will be a sacrifice. However, should you choose to stay, you will join them in the liminal realm of my mind, trapped for eternity like those who awakened me long ago. Your suffering will never end." Amiel questioned the creature. "What do you mean? Where have they gone?" "They have been removed from this world," is all Innqeshak told him. Weighing his options and attempting to judge the situation empirically, Amiel couldn't deny the unknown power this creature possessed. All of his crew were gone in the blink of an eye, and now he was left to decide his own fate. "What are you?" he asked. "You came before the age of the synthesis, did you not? Surely you can help remove it from Silverwind." The creature did not grant him a response, but rather it took one step forward, followed by another, and another. "What I am is unknowable to you. Where I come from is not natural for you. It is not real. It lies outside of time, beyond the scope of life and death, and outside the fabric of this reality and the spaces between. In that place I had always been, until I was not. To this valley I was sent, because I am not a cure, but a beacon through which calamity found this world. I am the torch it once did follow. Others came before you, long before the reckoning began. They felt my presence here and unraveled a yarn that was never meant to come undone. They opened a gateway that should have remained sealed, and for that I destroyed all but a remnant, and by the few who remained I was conquered and torn, but they succumbed to my madness in the end. This time I will remain." By then Innqeshak stood within arm's reach of Amiel, whose vision darkened with a grey mist. A burdensome pressure built up in his chest, his mind, his lungs, and during those moments he could feel every particle of his body begin to sever. "You have chosen wrongly," Innqeshak said, "and now your eternity has come." For a fraction of an instant, Amiel pled to be spared, but instead his body chose to scream, for the pain that overcame him was that of every cell in his body pulling apart. His spirit was migrating, and not just leaving the physical shell behind, but destroying it. And like the torches around him, whose flames were robust and bright one second and snuffed out the next, Amiel's soul fled into the mysterious darkness of a realm between life and death, a place outside time, a separate reality from which it could never return. All that remained was the creature he freed from the spires of Innqeshak, and one day, perhaps many years in the future, another soul might find itself in the same position as he.